Hello, sorry for the unusual attire. It's not a basic instinct situation. Basically, I'm in a rush, but I did promise I'd read these. So, well, I didn't promise, but there are some people who genuinely seem to enjoy me reading these, so I'm going to keep reading them. We only have a couple of short chapters today, but I didn't write it. Take it up with Douglas Adams. Use your best necromancy skills and have a whinge at him. So, Chapter 6 of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams.
Or I should have a good time. Message repeats. This is your captain speaking, so stop whatever you're doing and pay attention. First of all, I see from our instruments that we have a couple of hitchhikers aboard. Hello, wherever you are. I just want to make it totally clear that you are not at all welcome. I worked hard to get where I am today, and I didn't become captain of a Vogon constructor ship simply so I could turn into a taxi service for a load of degenerate freeloaders. I have sent out a search party, and as soon as they find you, I will put you off my ship. If you're very lucky, I might read you some of my poetry first. Secondly, we're about to jump into hyperspace for the journey to Barnard Star. On arrival, we will stay in dock for a 72-hour refit, and no one's to leave the ship during that time. I repeat, all planet leave is cancelled. I just had an unhappy love affair, so I don't see why anyone else should have a good time. Message ends.
The noise stopped. Arthur discovered to his embarrassment that he was lying curled up in a small ball on the floor with his arms wrapped around his head. He smiled weakly. "Charming man," he said. "I wish I had a daughter so I could forbid her to marry one." "You wouldn't need to," said Ford. "They've got as much sex appeal as a road accident." "No, don't move," he added as Arthur began to uncurl himself. "You'd better be prepared for the jump into hyperspace. It's unpleasantly like being drunk." "What's so unpleasant about being drunk?" "You ask a glass of water." Arthur thought about this. "Ford," he said. "Yeah?" "What's this fish doing in my ear?" "It's translating for you. It's a Babel fish. Look it up in the book if you like." He tossed over The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and then curled himself up into a fetal ball position to prepare himself for the jump. At that moment, the bottom fell out of Arthur's mind. His eyes turned inside out. His feet began to leak out of the top of his head. The room folded flat around him, spun around, shifted out of existence, left him sliding into his own navel. They were passing through hyperspace. "The Babel fish," said The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy quietly, "is a small, yellow, and leech-like, and probably the oddest thing in the universe. It feeds on brainwave energy received not from its own carrier, but from those around it. It absorbs all unconscious mental frequencies from this brainwave energy to nourish itself with. It then excretes into the mind of its carrier a telepathic matrix formed by combining the conscious thought frequencies with nerve signals picked up from the speech centers of the brain which has supplied them. The practical upshot of all this is that if you stick a Babel fish in your ear, you can instantly understand anything said to you in any form of language. The speech patterns you actually hear decode the brainwave matrix which has been fed into your mind by your Babel fish. Now, it has such a bizarrely improbable coincidence that anything so mind-bogglingly useful could have evolved purely by chance that some thinkers have chosen to see it as final and clinching proof of the non-existence of God. The argument goes something like this. "I refuse to prove that I exist," says God, "for proof denies faith, and without faith I am nothing. But," says man, "the Babel fish is a dead giveaway, isn't it? It could not have evolved by chance. It proves you exist, so therefore, by your own arguments, you don't. QED. "Oh dear," said God. "I hadn't thought of that," and promptly vanishes in a puff of logic. Oh, that was easy, says Man, and for an encore goes on to prove that black is white and gets himself killed on the next zebra crossing. Most leading theologians claim that this argument is a load of dingo's kidneys, but that didn't stop Oolong Kalufid making a small fortune when he used it as central theme for his best-selling book, Well, That About Wraps It Up for God. Meanwhile, the poor Babelfish, by effectively removing all barriers to communication between different races and cultures, has caused more and bloodier wars than anything else in the history of creation. Arthur let out a low groan. He was horrified to discover that the kick through hyperspace hadn't killed him. He was now 6 light years from the place that Earth would have been if it still existed. The Earth. Visions of it swam sickeningly through his nauseated mind. There was no way his imagination could feel the impact of the whole Earth having gone. It was too big. He prodded his feelings by thinking that his parents and his sister had been gone. No reaction. He thought of all the people he'd been close to. No reaction. Then he thought of the complete stranger he'd been standing behind in the queue at the supermarket 2 days before and felt a sudden stab. The supermarket was gone. Everyone in it was gone. Nelson's column had gone. Nelson's column had gone, and there'd be no outcry because there was no one left to make an outcry. From now on, Nelson's column only existed in his mind. England only existed in his mind. His mind stuck there in his dank, smelly, steel-lined spaceship. A wave of claustrophobia closed in on him. England no longer existed. He'd got that. Somehow, he'd got it. He tried again. America, he thought, was gone. He couldn't grasp it. New York was gone. No reaction. He never seriously believed it existed anyway. The dollar, he thought, has sunk forever. Slight tremor there. Every Bogart movie has been wiped, he said to himself, and that gave him a nasty knock. McDonald's, he thought, there is no longer any such thing as a McDonald's hamburger. He passed out. When he came round a second later, he found he was sobbing for his mother. He jerked himself violently to his feet. Ford? Ford looked up from where he was, sitting in a corner humming to himself. He always found the actual travelling through space part of space travel rather trying. Yeah, he said. If you're a researcher on this book thing, and you were on Earth, you must have been gathering material on it. Well, I was able to extend the original entry a bit, yeah. Well, let me see what it says in this edition then. I've got to see it. Yeah, okay. He passed it over again. Arthur grabbed hold of it and tried to stop his hand shaking. He pressed the entry for the relevant page. The screen flashed and swirled and resolved into a page of print. Arthur stared at it. It doesn't have an entry, he burst out. Ford looked over his shoulder. Yeah, it does, he said. Down there. See at the bottom of the screen, just under Eccentrica Golumbits, the triple-breasted whore of Eroticon 6. Arthur followed Ford's finger and saw where it was pointing. For a moment, it still didn't register, then his mind nearly blew up. What? Harmless? Is that all it's got to say? Harmless, one word? Ford shrugged. Well, there are 100 billion stars in the galaxy, and only a limited amount of space in the book's microprocessors, he said. And no one knew much about the Earth, of course. Well, for God's sake, I hope you managed to rectify that a bit. Oh, yeah, well, I managed to transmit a new entry off to the editor. He had to trim it a bit, but it's still an improvement. And what does it say now? Asked Arthur. Mostly harmless, admitted Ford, with a slightly embarrassing cough. Mostly harmless, shouted Arthur. What was that noise? Hissed Ford. It was me shouting, shouted Arthur. No, shut up, said Ford. I think we're in trouble. You think we're in trouble. Outside the door were the clear sounds of marching footsteps. They're dead Tracy, whispered Arthur. No, those are steel-tipped boots, said Ford. there was a sharp ringing rap on the door. "Then who is it?" said Arthur. "Well," said Ford, "if we're lucky it's just the Vogons coming to throw us into space." "And if we're unlucky?" "If we're unlucky," said Ford grimly, "the captain might be serious in his threat that he's going to read some of his poetry first." Chapter 7. Vogon poetry is, of course, the third worst in the universe. The second worst is that of the Asgoths of Krea. During a recitation of their poet master Grunthos the Flatulent of his poem Ode to a Small Lump of Green Putty I Found in My Armpit One Midsummer Morning, 4 of his audience died of internal hemorrhaging, and the president of the Mid-Galactic Arts Nobbling Council survived by gnawing one of his own legs off. Grunthos is reported to have been disappointed by the poem's reception and was about to embark on a reading of his 12-book epic entitled My Favourite Bath Time Gurgles, when his own major intestine, in a desperate attempt to save life and civilization, leapt straight up through his neck and throttled his brain. The very worst poetry of all perished along with its creator, Paul and Nancy Millstone Jennings of Greenbridge, Essex, England, in the destruction of the planet Earth. Prostetnik Vogongels smiled very slowly. This was done not so much for effect as because he was trying to remember the sequence of muscle movements. He had had a terribly therapeutic yell at his prisoners and was now feeling quite relaxed and ready for a little callousness. The prisoners sat in poetry appreciation chairs, strapped in. Vogon suffered no illusions as to the regard their works were generally held in. Their early attempts at composition had been part of a bludgeoning insistence that they be accepted as properly evolved and cultured race, but now the only thing that kept them going was sheer bloody-mindedness. The sweat stood out cold on Ford Prefect's brow and slid round the electrodes strapped to his temples. These were attached to a battery of electronic equipment, imagery intensifiers, rhythmic modulators, alliterative residulators, and simile dampers, all designed to heighten the experience of the poem and make sure that not a single nuance of the poet's thought was lost. Arthur Dent sat and quivered. He had no idea what he was in for, but what he knew that he hadn't liked anything that had happened so far and didn't think things were likely to change. The Vogon began to read, a fetid little passage of his own devising.
"Oh, Freddled Gruntbugley,"
he began. Spasms wrecked Ford's body. This was worse than he'd even prepared for.
"Thy micturations are to me as plurdled gabbled lodgets on a learned bee."
"Ah!" went Ford Prefect, wrenching his head back as lumps of pain thumped through it. He could dimly see beside him Arthur lolling and rolling in his seat. He clenched his teeth.
"Group, I implore thee,"
continued the merciless Vogon,
"my foonting turling drones."
His voice was rising to a horrible pitch of impassioned stridency.
"And hooptuously drangle me with crinkly brindleworts, or I will rend thee in the gobberwort with my blurdle cruncheon. See if I don't."
cried Ford Prefect, and through one final spasm at the electronic enhancement of the last line caught him full blast across the temples. He went limp. Arthur lolled.
"Now, earthlings,"
whirred the Vogon. He didn't know that Ford Prefect was in fact from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Beetlejuice, and wouldn't have cared if he had.
"I present you with a simple choice. Either die in the vacuum of space, or..."
He paused for melodramatic effect.
"Tell me how good you thought my poem was."
He threw himself backwards into a huge, leathery, bat-shaped seat and watched them. He did the smile again. Ford was rasping for breath. He rolled his dusty tongue around his parched mouth and moaned. Arthur said brightly, "Actually, I quite liked it." Ford turned and gaped. Here was an approach that had quite simply not occurred to him. The Vogon raised a surprised eyebrow that effectively obscured his nose and was therefore no bad thing.
"Oh, good,"
he whirred, in considerable astonishment. "Oh, yes," said Arthur. "I thought that some of the metaphysical imagery was really particularly effective." Ford continued to stare at him, slowly organising his thoughts around this totally new concept. Were they really going to be able to bareface their way out of this?
"Yes, do continue,"
invited the Vogon. "Oh, and interesting rhythmic devices too," continued Arthur, "which seem to counterpoint the he floundered. Ford leapt to the rescue, hazarding counterpoint the surrealism of the underlying metaphor of the he floundered too, but Arthur was ready again. Humanity of the Vogonity, Ford hissed at him. Ah, yes, Vogonity, sorry, of the poet's compassionate soul. Arthur felt that he was on a home stretch now, which contrives through the medium of the verse structure to sublimate this, transcend that, and come to terms with the fundamental dichotomies of the other. He was reaching a triumphant crescendo, and one is left with a profound and vivid insight into which suddenly gave out on him. Ford leapt in with a coup de grace. "Into whatever it is the poem was about," he yelled out of the corner of his mouth. "Well done, Arthur. That was very good." The Vogon perused them. For a moment his embittered racial soul had been touched. But he thought, no, too little, too late. His voice took on the quality of a cat snagging brushed nylon.
"So, what you're saying is that I write poetry because underneath my mean, callous, heartless exterior, I really just want to be loved?"
He paused.
"Is that right?"
Ford laughed a nervous laugh. "Well, I mean, yes," he said. "Don't we all, deep down, The Vogon stood up.
"No, well, you're completely wrong," he said. "I just write poetry to throw my mean, callous, heartless exterior into sharp relief. I'm going to throw you off the ship anyway. Guard, take the prisoners to number 3 airlock and throw them out."
"What?" shouted Ford. A huge young Vogon guard stepped forward and yanked them out of their straps with his huge blubbery arms. "You can't throw us into space," yelled Ford. "We're trying to write a book."
"Resistance is useless,"
shouted the Vogon guard back at him. It was the first phrase he learnt when he joined the Vogon Guard Corps. The captain watched with detached amusement and then turned away. Arthur stared round at him wildly. "I don't want to die now," he yelled. "I've still got a headache. I don't want to go to heaven with a headache. I'd be all cross and I wouldn't enjoy it." The guard grasped him firmly round the neck and, bowing deferentially towards his captain's back, hoiked them both protesting out of his bridge. A steel door closed and the captain was on his own again. He hummed quietly and mused to himself, lightly fingering his notebook of verses. He said,
"Counterpoint the surrealism of the underlying metaphor."
He considered this for a moment, and then closed the book with a grim smile.
"That's too good for them,"
he said. The long, steel-lined corridor echoed to the feeble struggles of the two humanoids clamped firmly under rubbery Vogon armpits. "This is great," spluttered Arthur. "This is really terrific. Let go of me, you brute." The Vogon guard dragged them on. "Don't you worry," said Ford. "I'll think of something." He didn't sound hopeful.
"Resistance is useless," bellowed the guard.
"Just don't say things like that," stammered Ford. "How can anyone maintain a positive mental attitude if you're saying things like that?" "My God, complained Arthur. "You're talking about a positive mental attitude, and you haven't even had your planet demolished today. I woke up this morning and thought I'd have a nice relaxed day, do a bit of reading, brush the dog. It's now just after 4 in the afternoon, and I'm already being thrown out of an alien spaceship 6 light years from the smoking remains of the Earth." He spluttered and gurgled as the Vogon tightened his grip. "All right," said Ford, "just stop panicking." "Who said anything about panicking?" snapped Arthur. "This is still just a culture shock. You wait till I've settled down into this situation and found my bearings. Then I'll start panicking." "Arthur, you're getting hysterical. Shut up." Ford tried desperately to think, but was interrupted by the guard shouting again. "Resistance is useless." "And you can shut up as well," snapped Ford. "Resistance is useless." "Oh, give it a rest," said Ford. He twisted his head till it was looking straight up at his captor's face. A thought struck him. Do you really enjoy this sort of thing?" he asked suddenly. The Vogon stopped dead, and a look of immense stupidity seeped slowly over his face. "Enjoy?" he boomed. "What do you mean?" "What I mean," said Ford, "is does it give you a full, satisfying life? Stomping around, shouting, pushing people out of spaceships?" The Vogon stared up at the low-level ceiling, and his eyebrows almost rolled over each other. His mouth slacked. Finally he said, "Well, the hours are good." "They'd have to be," agreed Ford. Arthur twisted his head round to look at Ford. "Ford, what are you doing?" he said in an amazed whisper. "Oh, just try and take an interest in the world around me, okay?" he said. "So, the hours are pretty good then?" he resumed. The Vogon stared down at him as sluggish thoughts moiled around in the murky depths. "Yeah," he said, "but now you come to mention it, most of the actual minutes are pretty lousy. Except," he thought again, which required looking at the ceiling, "except some of the shouting I quite like." He filled his lungs and bellowed, "Resistances!" "Sure, yeah," interrupted Ford hurriedly. "You're good at that, I can tell." "But if it's mostly lousy," he said slowly, giving the words time to reach their mark, "then why'd you do it? What is it? The girls? The leather? The machismo? Or do you just find that coming to terms with the mindless tedium of it all presents an interesting challenge?" Arthur looked backwards and forwards between them in bafflement. "Well, said the guard, I don't know, I think I just sort of do it, really. My aunt said that spaceship guard was a good career for a young Vogon. You know, the uniform, the low-slung stun ray holster, the mindless tedium." "There you are, Arthur," said Ford with the air of someone reaching the conclusion of his argument. "You think you've got problems." Arthur rather thought he had. Apart from the unpleasant business with his home planet, the Vogon guard had half-throttled him already, and he didn't like the sound of being thrown into space very much. "Try and understand his problem," insisted Ford. "Here he is, poor lad. His entire life's work is stamping around, throwing people off spaceships, and shouting," added the guard. "And shouting, sure," said Ford, patting his blubbery arm clamped round his neck in friendly condescension. "And he doesn't even know why he's doing it." Arthur agreed this was very sad. He did this with a small, feeble gesture, but because he was too asphyxiated to speak. Deep rumblings of bemusement came from the guard. "Well, now you put it like that, I suppose." "Good lad," encouraged Ford. "All right," went on the rumblings. "So what's the alternative?" "Well," said Ford brightly but slowly, "stop doing it, of course. Tell them," he went on, "you're not going to do it anymore." He felt he ought to add something to that, but for the moment the guard seemed to have his mind occupied pondering that much. Said the guard. Well, that doesn't sound that great to me." Ford suddenly felt the moment slipping away. "Now wait a minute," he said. "That's just the start, you see. There's more to it than that, you see." But at that moment the guard renewed his grip and continued his original purpose of lugging prisoners to the airlock. He was obviously quite touched. "No,
I think if it's all the same to you, he said, I'd better get you both shoved into this airlock and then go and get on with some other bits of shouting I've got to do.
It wasn't all the same to Ford Prefect at all. Oh, come on now, but look, he said, less slowly, less brightly. Said Arthur without any clear inflection. But hang on, pursued up Ford. There's music and art and things to tell you about yet.
Yeah! Resistance is useless,
bellowed the guard, and then added,
You see, if I keep it up, I can eventually get promoted up to senior shouting officer, and there aren't usually many vacancies for non-shouting and non-pushing people about officers, so I think I better stick to what I know.
They had reached the airlock. A large circular steel hatchway of massive strength and weight let into the inner skin of the craft. The guard operated a control, and the hatchway swung smoothly open.
But thanks for taking an interest,
said the Vogon guard.
Bye now.
He flung Ford and Arthur through the hatchway into the small chamber within. Arthur lay panting for breath. Ford scrambled round and flung his shoulder uselessly against the reclosing hatchway. But listen, he shouted to the guard. There's a whole world you don't know anything about. Here, how about this? Desperately, he grabbed the only bit of culture he knew offhand. He hummed the first bar of Beethoven's Fifth. Da 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 dum. Does that stir anything in you?
No, said the guard. Not really, but I'll mention it to my aunt.
If he said anything further after that, it was lost. The hatchway sealed itself tight, and all sound was lost by the faint, distant hum of the ship's engines. They were in a brightly polished cylindrical chamber about 6 feet in diameter and 10 feet long. Ford looked round it, panting. Potentially bright lad, I thought, he said, and slumped against the curved wall. Arthur was still lying in the curve of the floor where he had fallen. He didn't look up, he just lay panting. We're trapped now, aren't we? Yeah, said Ford, we're trapped. Well, didn't you think of anything? I thought you said you were going to think of something. Perhaps you thought of something and I didn't notice. Oh yeah, I thought of something, panted Ford. Arthur looked up expectantly. But unfortunately, continued Ford, you're rather involved being on the other side of this airtight hatchway. He kicked the hatch they had just been thrown through. But it was a good idea, was it? Oh yeah, very neat. What was it? Well, I haven't worked out the details yet. Not much point now, is there? Oh, so, what happens next? Asked Arthur. Oh, well, the hatchway in front of us will open automatically in a few moments and we'll shoot out into deep space, I expect, and asphyxiate. If you take a lungful of air with you, you can last for up to 30 seconds, of course, said Ford. He stuck his hands behind his back, raised an eyebrow, and started to hum an old Beetlejuicean battle hymn. To Arthur's eyes, he suddenly looked very alien. So this is it, said Arthur. We're going to die. Yeah, said Ford. Except, no, wait a minute. He suddenly lunged across the chamber at something behind Arthur's line of vision. What's this switch? He cried. What? Where? Cried Arthur, twisting round. No, I was only fooling, said Ford. We're going to die after all. He slumped against the wall again and carried on the tune from where he left off. You know, said Arthur, it's times like this, when I'm trapped in a Vogon airlock with a man from Beetlejuice and about to die of asphyxiation in deep space, that I really wish I'd listened to what my mother said when I was young. Why? What'd she tell you? I don't know, I didn't listen. Oh. Ford carried on humming. This is terrific, Arthur thought to himself. Nelson's column has gone. McDonald's has gone. All that's left is me and the words mostly harmless. Any second now, all that will be left is mostly harmless. And yesterday, the planet seemed to be going so well. A motor whirred. A slight hiss built into a deafening roar of rushing air as the outer hatchway opened to an empty blackness, studded with the tiny, impossibly bright points of light. Ford and Arthur popped into outer space like corks from a toy gun. Don't panic.